People think the danger's in the noise. They never notice the silence right before something goes wrong. August 1967, Chicago, Illinois. Backstage of a small but packed indoor venue, I remember the heat before I remember the sound. Not the kind of heat you can escape by stepping back, but the kind that sticks to your skin, seeps into your bones, and refuses to let go. Back then, the lights were brutal. No filters, no mercy. Just raw brightness pouring down like an interrogation lamp. I was standing in the shadows behind the curtain, pretending to breathe normally. On stage, the crowd was already alive, restless, hungry. They didn't know what they were waiting for. They never do. Michael was 8 years old, adjusting a microphone that was almost taller than him. People like to romanticize moments like that. They talk about destiny, talent, fate. What they don't talk about is how small he looked when the spotlight hit him, how the light didn't just illuminate him, it trapped him. The moment the curtain parted, everything slowed. The spotlight snapped on with a sharp hum, white and unforgiving. It locked onto Michael like a target. I felt my chest tighten, the way it does when something feels wrong but you can't name it yet. From where I stood, I could see what the audience couldn't. I saw his shoulders stiffen, just slightly, enough to make my stomach drop. Michael smiled. Of course he did. He always smiled. That smile had already learned its job. Reassure them, distract them, convince the world that nothing was out of place. The crowd responded instantly, a wave of cheers crashing toward the stage. But the light was too close, too strong. I glanced at the lighting rig above him. The bulbs glared back like unblinking eyes. Those lights ran hot. Everyone backstage knew it. Adults complained about it all the time. Performers twice Michael's age would step off stage sweating, dizzy, shaking their heads. And there he was, 8 years old, standing still, waiting for the music. The band hit the first note. Michael stepped forward, right into the center of the beam. That's when I noticed his blinking. Too fast, too frequent. It was subtle. So subtle that no one else would have caught it. Not the audience, not even the crew. But I'd grown up with him. I knew his rhythms, his tells, the tiny changes in his body language that signaled stress long before words ever did. His hands tightened around the microphone. Just for a second, then he started singing, and the crowd lost their minds. From the outside, it must have looked perfect. The sound, the confidence, the way his voice filled the room as if it didn't belong to a child at all. People leaned forward in their seats. Some laughed in disbelief. Others stared like they were watching something unreal. But my focus narrowed. Michael swayed. Not dancing, not moving with the beat. A slight shift of weight, barely there. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. I took a step closer to the edge of the curtain, careful not to be seen. If anyone noticed me now, it would break the illusion. And illusions were everything in this world. Once cracked, they never looked the same again. The spotlight buzzed faintly. The heat shimmered in the air around him. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself he'd done this 100 times before. I told myself he was strong. But then I saw his jaw clench. And that was when the silence hit me. Not the silence in the room, but the one inside my head. The kind that comes right before panic takes over. There were rumors later. People love rumors. Some would say he almost collapsed. Others whispered that someone backstage panicked. I need to be clear about one thing. There is no proof of anything dramatic happening on that stage. No fall, no public incident. What happened was quieter, more dangerous. Michael kept singing, but the way he held himself changed. His posture tightened like he was bracing against something invisible. The light pressed down on him, and for a terrifying moment, I wondered if he even realized how close he was to losing his balance. I scanned the stage manager. Nothing. The crew, calm, focused. The audience, captivated. I was alone with the fear. My mind raced through impossible options. Step out, signal someone, shut it down. Every choice felt like pulling a wire without knowing which one would explode everything. Michael blinked again, then he smiled wider. That's the part that still haunts me. Not the fear, but the control. At 8 years old, he was already learning how to override his body, how to ignore discomfort, how to perform through it. The music carried him forward, and he followed it like a lifeline. I remember gripping the curtain so hard my fingers hurt. I remember counting his breaths, silently, like it might somehow keep him steady. I remember thinking, this isn't how it's supposed to be. The spotlight never softened. The song went on, and with every second, the gap between what the crowd saw and what I felt grew wider, darker, more dangerous. Because once a child learns to stand still under a light that burns, something inside them changes. And I could feel that change beginning, right there, under that merciless beam. long before anyone else even thought to look. The song should have ended sooner, that was my first thought. The irrational kind your mind clings to when it needs something to blame. Time stretched unnaturally, each second dragging like it knew something the rest of us didn't. Michael was still singing, still smiling, still standing under that light. From the audience, it must have looked like confidence. From where I stood, it looked like restraint stretched to its breaking point. His voice stayed steady, but his body told a different story, one you'd only notice if you were watching for it, if you were afraid enough to notice everything. His knees locked, not dramatically, not visibly, just enough. I swallowed hard. I'd seen adults do that before, lock their knees under pressure, under heat, under lights that felt more like judgment than illumination. They always paid for it a moment later. Michael adjusted his grip on the microphone again. His fingers were tense now, knuckles pale against the metal. He shifted his weight, then corrected himself too quickly, like he'd almost leaned too far, and caught it just in time. Almost. That word echoed in my head, almost losing balance, almost too hot, almost too much. The spotlight seemed brighter now, or maybe my eyes were straining, trying to cut through it, trying to reach him through the glare. The beam wrapped around his small frame like a cage. There was nowhere for him to step that wasn't exposed. I glanced at the wings again. Still no reaction. The band was locked in. The crew trusted the routine. Routines make people blind. My chest tightened as a new thought crept in, cold, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. What if he doesn't know how close he is? At 8 years old, how do you measure danger when all you've ever been taught is to keep going? Michael's blinking slowed, but that didn't calm me. It made things worse. His eyes fixed forward now, glassy with focus, like he'd narrowed his world down to one rule. Don't stop. I felt a surge of anger then. Not at him, never at him, at the light, at the room, at the unspoken expectation that the show must always win. There's a strange kind of quiet that happens inside your head when panic sharpens into clarity. I remember it vividly. My thoughts stopped racing and lined up instead, one behind the other, heavy and deliberate. If he falters, everyone will notice. If everyone notices, the story changes. And once the story changes, you can't control where it goes. I hated that I was thinking like that, but I was. Because I knew the cost of interruption in this world. I knew how fast concern could turn into judgment, how quickly protection could be mistaken for weakness. Michael took a breath that was just a fraction too deep, then another. The song hit a familiar point, one he'd mastered 100 times. His voice lifted, clean and strong, and the crowd roared louder than before. The noise crashed over him, over all of us, disguising the danger beautifully. I wanted to shout. Instead, I stayed silent. That silence felt criminal. I watched his shoulders rise and fall, measured, controlled. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was managing the heat, managing the light, managing his own body, like it was something separate from him, something to be overridden. That realization hit me harder than the fear. This wasn't a moment of chaos. It was a moment of adaptation. There were whispers later, always whispers, that someone backstage noticed and panicked, that someone almost stepped in. If those whispers ever mentioned me, they got one thing wrong. I didn't panic. I calculated. Every second I weighed outcomes I never should have had to consider. I watched for the smallest sign, a stumble, a crack, a hesitation that would give me permission to act. None came. Michael didn't sway again. He didn't blink too fast. He didn't miss a beat, and somehow that terrified me more, because it meant he'd found a way through it. The lights stayed locked on him until the final note. When the music stopped, the applause detonated through the room, thunderous and unrelenting. The spotlight snapped off a second later, plunging the stage into a softer glow. That was when I moved. The moment the beam released him, Michael exhaled. Sharp, fast, uncontrolled. Not part of the act. Real. I saw his shoulders drop just for a split second, like something heavy had finally been lifted. He turned toward the wings, toward me. Our eyes met, and in that instant something passed between us that I still can't fully explain. Not fear, not relief, recognition. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. But I knew, deep down, that something irreversible had just begun. A lesson learned too early, too quietly, under a light that asked too much, and got exactly what it wanted. The crowd was still cheering. They had no idea how close they'd come to seeing a different ending, and neither did Michael. Not yet. The applause followed him backstage like a living thing. Loud, relentless, unaware. Michael stepped off the stage, and the noise softened instantly, swallowed by concrete walls and hanging cables. The contrast was violent. One second, he was a miracle. The next, he was just a kid standing under flickering fluorescent lights that did nothing to hide how pale his face had become. I reached him before anyone else. Up close, the damage was clearer, not dramatic, not obvious, but unmistakable if you knew where to look. His breathing was shallow now, carefully controlled, like he was afraid that if he let it go naturally, something else might slip with it. "You good?" I asked. It was the kind of question people ask when they already know the answer but need to hear the lie anyway. He nodded too quickly. "I'm okay." Those exact words, calm, polite, final. I studied him in silence. The sweat on his forehead wasn't from dancing. It was the kind that comes from heat trapped too long, from pressure without release. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on his pants, then folded them together, forcing stillness. That's when it hit me, the moment that shifted everything. He wasn't waiting for help. He was waiting for permission to move on. Crew members rushed past us, energized, congratulating each other, already talking about the next set, the next night, the next city. Someone clapped Michael lightly on the shoulder and said, "You killed it, little man." Michael smiled again. That smile, it came back faster than it should have. I felt something tighten in my chest, sharp and unpleasant. This wasn't resilience, this was conditioning. And it was happening in real time, right in front of me. I guided him to a folding chair near the wall, away from the noise. He sat down carefully, posture straight, hands in his lap like he was afraid slouching might be interpreted as weakness. His feet didn't touch the ground. 8 years old. I crouched in front of him, lowering my voice. "You felt the lights, didn't you?" For the first time since he walked off stage, he hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Then he nodded. "They were really bright," he said, choosing the softest words available, like anything stronger might get him in trouble. Bright, not hot, not overwhelming, not too much. Bright. I leaned back on my heels and exhaled slowly. That word told me everything. He was already editing his experience, filtering it, reshaping it into something acceptable, something manageable, something survivable. There are things you don't forget when you see them happen the first time. That was one of them. No one made a report. No one stopped the show. No one pulled him aside for a long conversation about limits or safety. Why would they? Nothing bad had happened. Except something had. Something quiet. Something internal. I noticed how Michael watched the hallway now, how his eyes followed every movement, every passing shadow. He wasn't resting. He was resetting, preparing himself in case he was needed again. That was the part that felt wrongest of all. Later, there would be talk. Just talk, nothing official. People would speculate that moments like this were when Michael began developing an obsession with control. Lighting angles, stage positions, distances, timing. I want to be careful here. Those claims are interpretations, not facts. But what is a fact is this. After that night, Michael never stepped into a spotlight without studying it first. I saw him do it again and again. He'd glance up, measure it, adjust his stance before anyone told him to. Not fearfully, precisely. Back then, I didn't have language for what I was witnessing. I just knew it felt wrong to watch a child learn how to override discomfort instead of question it. I sat beside him while the venue emptied, the echoes of the crowd fading into nothing. He swung his legs slightly now, the tension loosening just enough to remind me how young he really was. "You did great," I said. He nodded. Then quietly, almost like he was confessing something, he said, "I didn't want to mess it up." That was it. That was the sentence that stayed with me. Not I was scared. Not it was too much. Just I didn't want to mess it up. I realized then that whatever had happened under that light wasn't over when the song ended. It had followed him off stage, slipped into his thinking, rewired his priorities without asking permission. The real danger hadn't been the heat. It had been the lesson that as long as you keep going, no one stops you. That if you don't fall, no one asks how close you came. I looked at him, small, composed, already rebuilding himself for the next performance, and understood something with chilling clarity. The spotlight didn't almost take him down. It taught him how to stand still while everything inside him screamed to move. And once a child learns that, there's no easy way back. The venue emptied faster than it should have. Applause has a strange half-life. It feels eternal when you're standing in it, then vanishes the second it's no longer needed. Chairs scraped, doors slammed. Laughter faded down concrete hallways. What remained backstage was something colder, heavier, and far more honest. Michael sat beside me, still too composed. That was the detail that unsettled me most. Kids don't sit like that after adrenaline burns off. They slump, they fidget, they complain. Michael did none of it. He stayed upright. eyes forward like the performance hadn't ended, like he was still on stage in his mind, still under that light. I watched him closely, closer than I ever had before. His breathing was steadier now, but not relaxed. Controlled, deliberate, as if he'd discovered that calm wasn't something you waited for. It was something you forced into existence. I felt a wave of guilt crash over me, slow and suffocating, because I hadn't stopped it. Because I'd stood there, calculated risks like a strategist instead of reacting like a brother. I told myself it was the right call. I told myself everything turned out fine. But fine is a dangerous word. Someone handed Michael a cup of water. He took it with both hands, thanked them politely, took a small sip, then set it down untouched. His fingers lingered on the rim, gripping it just a little too long. "You sure you're okay?" I asked again. This time he didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, thinking, not searching for the truth, searching for the correct response. "I can do it again if I need to," he finally said. My stomach dropped. That wasn't reassurance. That was a warning. Again, as if this moment, this near breaking point, had already been filed away as something repeatable, acceptable, necessary. I shook my head. "You won't have to." But even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded. This world doesn't run on promises. It runs on momentum. And Michael had it, more than anyone else, even at 8 years old. Momentum that didn't care about age or limits or what it cost to maintain. There are always rumors, that nights like this were discussed later behind closed doors, that concerns were raised, adjustments made. I need to be precise. There is no verified record of any official intervention tied to this specific performance. What did happen was subtler. Michael began watching everything, the lights, the spacing, the timing between songs, not with fear but with calculation. I saw it in the days that followed, but it started here, in this quiet backstage room where the noise had finally died and no one was paying attention anymore. He was learning where the edges were by remembering how close he'd come to them. That's how survival instincts evolve when they're rewarded. No one pulled him aside and said, "You shouldn't have to endure that." Instead, he was praised, celebrated, held up as proof that he could handle more. I remember placing a hand on his shoulder and feeling how tense it still was, muscle tight like a wire pulled too far and locked in place. He didn't flinch. He didn't relax either. "I was watching you," I said quietly, "the whole time." He looked at me then, really looked at me. His eyes softened just a little. "I know," he said. That was another realization that hit harder than I expected. He'd known. All along, he'd known someone saw what was happening, and he kept going anyway. That wasn't bravery, not entirely. That was pressure internalized. The crew started packing up equipment. The spotlight rig powered down with a mechanical whine that echoed through the room. The same light that had pressed down on him minutes earlier now looked harmless, lifeless. I stared at it, anger simmering under my skin. It was just a tool, and yet it had done its work. Michael stood up slowly, tested his balance without realizing he was doing it, then nodded to himself. Passed the test, ready to move forward. As we walked toward the exit, I felt the weight of what had changed settle in, not in him alone, in me, because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Surviving a moment doesn't mean escaping it. Sometimes it means carrying it forward, letting it shape how you move, how you decide, how much of yourself you're willing to ignore next time. The crowd was gone. The danger was gone. But the lesson stayed. And I knew, deep down, with a certainty that made my chest ache, that this wasn't the end of the story. It was the point of no return. The night didn't end when we left the building. That's what people never understand about moments like this. They think danger has an exit door, that once you step outside, it stays behind. But some things don't stay where they happen. Some things follow you quietly, embedding themselves so deeply, they start to feel like instinct. The parking lot was nearly empty. Streetlights buzzed overhead, softer than the spotlight, kinder. But Michael still glanced up at them as we walked. Just a quick look, a measurement. Then his eyes returned forward. I noticed. Of course I did. He didn't complain on the ride back. He didn't fall asleep either. He sat still, hands folded, gaze fixed on nothing in particular, not exhausted, alert, like a system that refused to power down. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell him that what happened wasn't normal, that it wasn't fair, that it shouldn't have been on him to endure it. But words felt dangerous, like they might crack something open that neither of us knew how to close again. So I stayed quiet. And in that silence, I realized the truth that would haunt me long after that night faded from memory. The moment under the spotlight hadn't broken him. It had taught him something. It taught him that discomfort could be negotiated, that limits were flexible, That if you stayed upright, if you kept delivering, no one would stop you, no matter how intense the pressure became. That was the real shift, not visible, not dramatic, but permanent. In the days that followed, nothing looked different on the surface. Michael rehearsed, he performed, he smiled. The world saw the same prodigy it always had, but I saw the adjustment happening in real time, subtle and precise. He positioned himself more carefully on stage. He watched lighting cues before stepping forward. He learned how to stand where the heat felt less aggressive. No one told him to do these things. He figured them out on his own. There are people who say moments like this explain everything that came later. I won't go that far. Life isn't that simple. And neither was he. But I will say this, with certainty, without exaggeration. That night changed the way Michael understood performance. It stopped being just expression. It became management. And that understanding didn't come from confidence. It came from proximity to something that could have gone wrong and didn't, only because he adapted fast enough. Years later, people would praise his precision, his control, his insistence on perfection. They'd call it genius, discipline, vision. Few would ever ask where it began. I know where it began. It began with an 8-year-old boy standing under a light that was too strong, in a room that wanted too much, deciding, without saying a word, that he would never let the environment decide for him again. As for me, I carried my own change out of that venue. I learned that watching isn't the same as protecting. That calculation can feel responsible while still leaving scars. That silence, even when it keeps the show intact, has consequences. I told myself I'd be closer after that, more alert, less willing to assume things would work out. And in some ways, I was. But I also knew the truth I didn't want to admit. Once a child proves they can endure, the world rarely asks them to stop. The spotlight that night didn't just test Michael. It tested everyone around him, and we all passed, for better or worse. The crowd never knew how close the story came to changing. But I remember, because some moments don't announce themselves as turning points. They just quietly decide the direction and wait for the rest of the world to catch up.